The red steel door of Unit 14 rolled upward with a heavy metallic shutter that carried through the entire storage row, and the sound alone was enough to make Jean stop just outside the threshold. She had expected clutter, maybe a forgotten dresser or a box of Christmas ornaments, something ordinary and sagging with time. Instead, she saw a room filled edge to edge, floor to ceiling, with plastic storage bins, hundreds of them, stacked in columns that rose like rigid towers, each bin sealed, labeled, and aligned with the kind of precision she had once admired in well-run classrooms. The morning light slanted in across the concrete and touched the columns in soft reflections, revealing white labels marked only by neat black codes. B 017 C204X 511. Nothing descriptive, no handwriting smudges, no quick notes about kitchen or winter clothes. Everything was uniform, intentional, almost unervingly calm. It took Jean a long moment to realize she was holding her breath. She stood with her husband, Harold, who still clutched the brass key they had bought minutes earlier. He was 68, with mechanics' old strength in his hands and a softness in his eyes that years of factory work had never managed to wear down. She was 70, a retired schoolteacher whose life had slowly shifted from bustling hallways to quiet mornings filled with crossword puzzles, careful budgeting, and the ache of wanting something meaningful to put her energy into. They lived comfortably but cautiously, surviving on his pension, her teacher's retirement, and a handful of savings they treated as fragile. Buying a storage unit had never been on their list of sensible decisions. Yet there they were, two older people with a bid paddle and a key, staring at what looked less like abandoned property and more like an archive someone never intended to lose. The idea of attending an auction had begun as a small thought, drifting into their days through conversations that seemed harmless at the time. A neighbor mentioned how her son's unpaid unit had gone up for sale. Harold paused on a TV channel, where bidders argued over crates of dusty tools. Jean overheard women at the library whispering about units full of sealed bins. You can't see what's inside, could be anything. Curiosity was one part of it, but there was also the quiet truth Jean rarely said aloud. She missed feeling useful. After 40 years spent sorting papers, shaping routines, and helping students find order in their young, chaotic lives, retirement sometimes felt like a room where nothing needed her anymore. Sorting bins, cataloging items, and perhaps selling a few things online sounded less like a gamble and more like a project she could hold on to. The auction itself was smaller than the ones on television. A handful of regular buyers leaned against their trucks, whispering numbers and estimates. Younger faces filmed everything for online channels Jean didn't recognize. The early units were forgettable. Soft furniture ruined by mildew, baby items from another decade, a broken treadmill that drew zero bids. Then the manager rolled open Unit 14. The crowd quieted, baffled. Too much work, someone muttered. Not worth the time, another said before walking off. But Jean saw what they didn't. The deliberate arrangement, the symmetry, the discipline. Someone had packed this place as if they expected to return. Someone who valued order. Someone who labeled things the way she once had. The bidding started low, the crowd unenthusiastic. The numbers climbed slowly, pushed more by habit than hunger. When the bidding forced its way past $1,500, only one other bidder remained. A thin woman with a tape measure clipped to her belt, her expression tight with calculation. Jean could feel Harold's unease to the fabric of his jacket sleeve. They had agreed on a hard limit of $3,000, a number that made her stomach tighten each time she imagined the withdrawal hitting their savings. As the auctioneer called for $1,900, then $2,000, the woman hesitated. She lifted her card, then lowered it again with a tight exhale. Jean's gaze drifted back to the unit, and her eyes caught on a single label near the rear. Archive. Not a code. A word. A choice. A message. 2,000 going once. The auctioneer called, voice rising with impatience. Jean's heart thudded softly beneath her coat. She thought of the years she had spent organizing supply closets, decoding students' handwriting, bringing order into places that had needed direction. Something in this unit called to that part of her, not in a greedy way, but in a purposeful one. She lifted their bidder number, her hand steady in a way that surprised even her. 2,100, the auctioneer announced. The thin woman shrugged in defeat and stepped back. No one else raised a card. Sold. When the crowd moved on to the next unit, the hallway grew still. Jean and Harold stood in front of their new purchase, the brass key now warm from his palm. The manager handed them their receipt and reminded them, almost casually, that they had 48 hours to clear the space or request an extension. The number on the page, $2 100 plus fees, looked bold and irreversible. Yet when the manager drove away in his golf cart, leaving them in the long quiet between the units, Jean felt something stirring that she hadn't felt in a long time. Anticipation. The good kind. The kind that carried possibility. When they raised the door again, the interior felt different. Less overwhelming and more like a task waiting for hands that understood structure. Harold set the dolly beside the door. Jean unfolded the small table they brought. The nearest bin, labeled B001, sat just inside the threshold, its lid clipped tight. Through the clear plastic, she could see shapes wrapped in brown paper, edges neat, bundles tied with string. Not junk, not chaos. Intent. She rested her hand on the lid, her breath steadying, her eyes tracing the rows of bins disappearing into the dim interior. "Let's take this slow," she said softly, almost the way she'd spoken before starting a new semester. "We write everything down. We don't throw anything out until we know what it is." Harold lifted the camera, ready to document. Jean lifted the latches, each one giving a small, confident click. And as she opened the first box, she felt the unmistakable sense that whatever story lay inside the strange, plastic-walled room had just begun to unfold for them, one careful piece at a time. Jean sat at the small folding table just inside the unit's threshold, her notebook open, pen ready, and the faint morning breeze carrying the cool scent of concrete and dust across the back of her hands. The first open bin, B001, sat beside her like a sealed memory finally allowed to breathe. Inside were dozens of brown paper bundles, each tied with thin cotton string, each labeled in the same precise handwriting as the exterior codes. She lifted one bundle carefully, feeling an almost ceremonial weight to the act, the way she used to feel sorting through old student portfolios. When she unwrapped the paper, a collection of antique postcards appeared, hundreds of them, neatly stacked, their edges worn but intact. They were from cities across the world, each written in small, tidy cursive, none addressed to the same person. Some weren't addressed at all. She laid them out in gentle rows, noticing that many had never been mailed, yet bore messages like whispered fragments of someone's internal landscape. It felt less like rummaging through a strange of belongings and more like opening someone's secret archive of places they had loved or imagined. While she cataloged the postcards, Harold rolled out the second bin, C017. He lifted the lid with a slow, steady motion meant to preserve the order inside. This bin held something entirely different. Dozens of velvet pouches, each containing a small metal object wrapped in fabric. When he unwrapped the first pouch, a brass compass rested in his palm, the glass still clear, the needle sharp in its movements. The next pouch held a pocket watch engraved with initials they didn't recognize. Another held a miniature telescope. Jean glanced at the items with a frown that was more curiosity than concern. None of these objects belonged together in any ordinary sense. They were personal, valuable, but entirely mismatched. "Who collects like this?" she murmured, writing down each object slowly. "And why pack them into a storage unit like they were pieces of single story?" The deeper they went, the stranger the pattern became. Box after box revealed more carefully preserved items. Old medals, small locked journals with no keys, a sealed tin marked photographs, "Do not expose," wrapped carefully in 3 layers of cloth. Some bins contained envelopes marked simply with dates, nothing else. Others held binders with empty plastic sleeves, every sleeve numbered though none filled. Jean felt the same subtle tension she used to sense when she discovered a student had filled a notebook with intricate codes instead of assignments. Not dangerous, not alarming, but layered in intention she didn't yet understand. As she sorted the items into label piles, she found herself slipping back into the rhythm that had defined most of her adult life. Organizing chaos into meaning, trusting that patterns reveal themselves when approached with patience rather than haste. Around late morning, the manager drifted past in his golf cart, pretending not to look directly at them while clearly observing the columns of bins they had pulled out. Jean lifted a hand in a polite wave. He returned it with a stiff smile, the kind that carried curiosity beneath its professionalism. When he drove off again, she exhaled slowly. "He thinks we found something," she said softly. "Even though we haven't found anything yet." "Not exactly." Harold nodded as he taped the lid back onto an empty bin. "People here see bins and think money," he said. "But this doesn't feel like money. It feels like somebody's unfinished work." Early afternoon brought a shift in the atmosphere inside the unit. The sun moved overhead, and the light that filtered into the room turned cooler, more directional, revealing details they hadn't noticed earlier. Faint color differences between the columns, minor variations in handwriting, subtle shifts in the type of plastic used. Jean realized these bins weren't assembled all at once. They were built over years. The archive label she had noticed on the back stack no longer felt like an isolated detail. It felt like a quiet truth. The unit was less a storage space and more a personal vault of memories and artifacts someone had curated with enormous care. Halfway through opening box E112, Jean discovered the first item that truly unsettled her. Not because it was disturbing, but because it was far too personal. Buried beneath bundles of letters wrapped in twine lay a school ID badge from a district she had never worked in, belonging to a child she didn't know. Dated 18 years earlier. The child's photo was cheerful, the kind of unself-conscious smile students used to give her before they became self-conscious teenagers. Yet something about the ID's placement, buried deep, preserved without damage, made her chest tighten. "Harold," she said quietly, handing it to him. "Why would someone keep something like this? It's not a collectible. It's not valuable. It's—" She didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need her to. They both felt the same quiet ripple of unease. To break the tension, she filmed a small update for their daughter, a habit she had begun as a way to share their little adventures without overwhelming her with daily calls. She spoke softly into the camera, smiling as naturally as she could. "If you're watching this, sweetheart, wish us luck as we sort through these mysterious bins. And if anyone likes watching two retirees try to make sense of someone else's archive, give the video a like, leave a comment with your guesses, and subscribe so you don't miss the next part." It was half joke, half invitation, a gentle nod to the countless channels that existed for people exactly like her, people rediscovering curiosity later in life. When she tucked the phone away, she felt steadier, as though being witnessed helped untangle the strangeness of it all. By late afternoon, they had uncovered a cluster of bins that seemed different from the rest. Their labels began with the letter X, and the handwriting on them appeared slightly shakier, as though written later in life. X204 held only sealed envelopes, each stamped with dates spanning nearly 40 years. X309 held cassette tapes labeled in the same meticulous hand, though many had no titles. X511, the deepest of the group, revealed a bundle of small metal keys attached to tags bearing nothing but numbers, no explanations, no names, no locks in sight. Jean lifted them slowly, feeling a faint tremor of connection to something she could not yet name. "This person wasn't collecting things," she said softly. "They were collecting pieces of what I don't know, but they meant something to someone." As they prepared to close up for the day, Jean stepped back to absorb the sight of the half-sorted unit. The concrete floor was covered in neat grids of items placed in careful rows. Postcards, medals, tapes, envelopes, pouches, journals, tools, trinkets, and dozens of objects that belonged to no category she had ever taught or studied. All of them preserved. All of them intentional. All of them unexplained. When Harold locked the door for the night, the air around them had shifted again, not ominous, not threatening, but weighted with the feeling that they had stepped into a story much larger than their small retirement routine. Jean paused before turning away, her gaze lingering on the red metal door, the afternoon sun giving it a warm glow. "There's something in there," she whispered. "Something we haven't seen yet. And I think tomorrow is when we find it." By the time Jean and Harold returned the next morning, the storage lot felt subtly changed, as though the quiet had learned their footsteps and now listened more closely. A thin overcast sky smoothed the light into a soft gray, sharpening every outline. The red metal doors, the gravel paths, the endless rows of concrete rectangles that stretched like a grid of forgotten stories. Jean carried her thermos in one hand and the ring of keys in the other, the cold metal warming slowly against her palm. She felt an unusual steadiness inside her, the kind she used to feel before parent-teacher conferences or school exhibitions, when she knew the day would ask something of her she hadn't yet named. Inside the unit, the air was cool and still, the faint scent of dust and old plastic settling around them the moment the door rolled up. The bins they had sorted yesterday remained exactly where they had left them. Neat grids across the concrete, labeled in her careful handwriting. But the untouched columns toward the back loomed larger now, their stacked boxes forming a kind of quiet wall. The codes X, 600 through X, 700 handwritten in darker ink that caught the eye. Jean exhaled slowly, choosing to start from the midsection rather than the back row, wanting to maintain the balance of method over impulse. She opened bin G053 first. Inside lay a collection of folded maps, city grids, national parks, foreign train routes, each marked with tiny dots in red pen. She unfolded them one by one, laying them flat, tracing each red mark with her fingertip. They didn't form a pattern she could understand yet, but she cataloged them carefully, knowing that sometimes patterns reveal themselves only after enough pieces have been laid out. Harold worked on bin H014, which held something far heavier than he expected. Beneath a blanket of fabric lay a stack of metal tins, each sealed with tape and labeled only with years: 1978, 1982, 1991, 2003. He opened the first cautiously, revealing dozens of printed photographs, each wrapped in wax paper. The images captured people in mundane settings: market stalls, train platforms, school hallways, airport lobbies, none posed, none aware of the camera. Some photos had dates written on the back, others numbers that didn't correspond to anything they'd seen. Harold placed them gently beside Jean, his brow furrowed. "Why keep all this?" he asked softly, though he didn't expect an answer. "Why document strangers for decades and hide it in bins?" Jean understood the weight of his unease. While sorting through countless belongings as a teacher had sharpened her ability to read meaning where others saw clutter, this unit felt unlike anything she'd encountered. These weren't personal mementos, nor were they random leftovers someone had forgotten. They were curated. Intentionally, meticulously, even obsessively curated. She wrote down each detail, trying to maintain professionalism in the face of something that teetered between archival work and discovery of a private world that had never been meant for strangers. Around midday, the oddness deepened. In bin K 201, Jean found a set of cassette tapes marked only with the word voices. She held them carefully, recognizing the fragile weight of analog media. Beneath the tapes lay a small recorder, vintage but in good condition, wrapped in cloth to protect the buttons. She didn't play anything. Not yet. She placed the recorder beside her notes, feeling the quiet promise of answers and uncertainty in equal measure. In the next bin, she uncovered a stack of notebooks, each page filled with tiny writing. Rows of descriptions that looked like observation logs. Times, locations, brief comments. Woman with blue scarf, third bench. Stayed 22 minutes. Nothing sinister on the surface. Nothing comforting either. More like someone was documenting the world, as if afraid it might disappear without record. Harold approached with yet another find, a set of envelopes bound in rubber bands. Inside each envelope lay multiple keys, small brass ones, larger steel ones, some with numbers stamped onto them, some entirely blank. Hundreds of keys, none labeled with anything recognizable. He laid them out across the floor, and for a moment both of them simply stared at the strange mosaic. Jean finally spoke, her voice low. "This doesn't feel like one person's keepsakes. It feels like—" She searched for the right phrase. "Like someone spent years gathering fragments that belonged to other people." The manager passed again around early afternoon, his glance lingering longer than the day before. Jean offered another polite wave. This time, he didn't return it. He slowed the cart briefly, looking at the spread of objects, then drove on. Harold watched him go, his jaw tightening with the quiet awareness that attention can shift from curiosity to suspicion quickly in places like this. "We should keep the valuables in the car," he murmured. Jean nodded. They gathered the more precious items, the compasses, watches, gold coins, and the tin of photographs, and locked them inside their trunk, careful not to appear defensive. They returned to the unit with an unspoken understanding that something about this auction find was beginning to attract the kind of interest that wasn't just casual. By late afternoon, they approached the back section at last. Bin X 601 opened with a muted creak. Inside lay bundles of letters wrapped in red string, far older than the others. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, the handwriting beautiful, flowing lines that belonged to another generation. Jean unfolded one letter and felt her breath shift. The writing wasn't in English. It looked like French, maybe, but with phrasing that suggested it was written decades ago. Perhaps longer. The signature belonged to someone named Emile, a name repeated in several other envelopes. None of the letters were addressed to the same person. Some weren't addressed at all. It was as if whoever collected them had preserved private correspondence that had no connection to the rest of the items in the unit. Harold opened the next bin. Inside, lying atop a nest of fabric, was a small wooden box with a sliding lid. When he opened it, a series of neatly labeled index cards lay inside, each detailing an object they had already found, or had yet to discover. Jean felt a chill. "This is a catalog," she said softly. Someone documented everything. But why leave the objects unorganized in bins if they cataloged them so precisely? But the strangest discovery of the day came just as they were preparing to close. Jean opened bin X 639 and froze. Inside was nothing but a flip phone, old and scratched, wrapped in a plastic bag. It wasn't plugged in. There was no charger. Just a phone, cushioned by layers of cloth. She handed it to Harold, unsure whether to touch the buttons. "Who stores a phone like this?" she whispered. "And why seal like evidence?" When Harold pressed the power button, the screen lit faintly, revealing a single unread message. It was time-stamped 9 years earlier. The message had no sender name, no number, just one line. "If you found this unit, leave it. You're not meant to continue." Jean stared at the screen, her pulse climbing with a slow, heavy rhythm. She had no explanation for the message, no frame of reference, no neat mental folder to place it in. She only knew that someone somewhere had anticipated the discovery of the storage unit, anticipated her and Harold standing here, anticipated every bin they would open, and whoever wrote that message had expected them to stop. They did not stop. They closed the storage door for night, the red metal echoing faintly as it descended. As they walked toward the car, neither spoke. They didn't need to. The quiet between them held the same recognition. They were in the middle of something far larger than a simple storage auction. And tomorrow, the truth hiding behind those red plastic bins would no longer be content to stay quiet. The next morning arrived with a heavy stillness, the kind that made the world feel stalled between breaths, and Jean sensed it the moment she stepped out of the car. The storage lot looked the same. The red doors lined in perfect squares, the gravel waking under their steps, the faint metallic smell in the cool air. But something in the atmosphere felt slightly off, as if the place had been waiting for them in a way that wasn't passive. She held her tote close, feeling the shape of her notebook pressing to the canvas like an anchor. Harold walked a few steps ahead, scanning the rows with the same steady vigilance he developed after decades of managing maintenance at their old district school. They didn't discuss the message on the old flip phone. They didn't have to. It hovered behind every thought, shadowing their curiosity without extinguishing it. Inside, the unit greeted them with the same wall of plastic bins, but the light fell differently today, dipping into corners that once seemed harmless. The bins in the back, those marked with X-series codes, appeared sharper, as if the dust had settled in patterns overnight. Jean set her thermos aside and opened the notebook where on the previous night she had written 3 full pages of questions. None of them had answers yet, but writing them had steadied her nerves. She looked over the grid she had charted, noting the sections they had completed and the ones they had barely touched. The back row, X 640 to X 700, waited like a silent threshold she wasn't sure she was ready to cross but knew she would. They began with bin X 642. Inside lay bundles of envelopes sorted in a way that didn't match any postal system she recognized, stacked by color rather than date. Some sealed, some empty, some with stamps but no addresses. Jean unfolded several carefully. Most contained nothing. Others held clipped newspaper headlines in languages she couldn't read. One contained a photo of a train station clock striking noon, the timestamp on the back reading only 12 o'clock, 14th. No year, no month, just a moment. Harold studied the image for a long time before placing it back in the envelope. Jean sensed that neither of them fully understood the scale of the puzzle they had stepped into. Bin X, 647, held something heavier, a metal box with a sliding latch. Inside were dozens of rings, ordinary ones, cheap ones, toy ones, rusty ones, old ones' initials engraved, and none of them matched. Someone had collected objects that clearly belonged to many different people, spanning decades, maybe more. Under the rings lay a folded sheet of paper, the edges cracked from age. It listed dates without context, arranged in columns that didn't match calendars she knew. Jean wrote everything down mechanically, understanding that she was no longer simply cataloging a stranger's belongings. She was attempting to map a pattern of behavior that she didn't yet have language for. Returning to lighter bins felt like surfacing for air. Bin X, 650, held a stack of household items. Measuring spoons, candles, small silver frames without photos. But beneath them, carefully wrapped, lay a velvet pouch containing 2 gold bracelets with engravings in a delicate, looping script. Jean held one under the single fluorescent bulb and felt a quiet awe settle through her. These were items someone valued deeply at some point in time. Yet now they were here, buried among unrelated fragments like misplaced chapters from different books. She imagined the person who had placed them here. Was it the same individual who cataloged everything so meticulously? Or was a unit the work of more than one hand, gradually layered over years? The thought made the story feel larger than the square footage of the unit. By midday, they had created a growing island of categorized items across the concrete. Maps, letters, objects of value, objects of mystery, objects that made no sense at all. Harold had taken to sorting keys again, laying them in long lines on a flattened cardboard box. There were so many: house keys, luggage keys, locker keys, keys shaped for cabinets and drawers, keys stamped with unfamiliar brands, keys too old to fit modern locks. The sheer volume made Jean's chest tighten. Whoever collected these items had not simply stored the past. They had siphoned it, gathered it, preserved in a way that felt intentional yet indecipherable. They decided to test one thing: whether any of the keys matched any of the locks inside the unit itself. Harold tried several on the bin padlocks. None fit. Then he tried a few on the metal box they found earlier. None worked. Jean tried a row of smaller keys on the old cassette recorder. Still nothing. It was as if the unit held a city of locks and a city of keys, but each belonged to different worlds. The disconnect deepened the mystery instead of solving it. In the early afternoon, Jean opened Bin X, 660, the heaviest one yet. Inside lay stacks of documents, thick folders wrapped in twine, each filled with photocopies of certificates, property files, school rosters, and reports that looked like they had been pulled from administrative offices decades earlier. Many referenced schools she recognized by name, though some had merged or shut down years ago. As a former teacher, she could read these documents like familiar terrain, and the more she read, the more the picture sharpened. These files didn't originate from a single building. They came from dozens of institutions across several counties. Whoever had collected them had been pulling pieces of educational records long before this unit was abandoned. Jean felt a jolt of something almost like grief. These weren't relics of negligence. They were pieces of systems, patterns of someone watching the world from obscure angles. A single sheet fell from one of the folders. A list of locker numbers from a school she once worked at, dated nearly 15 years ago. She traced her finger along the names and felt a soft ache of recognition, not of the people, but of the era. The handwriting on the note was unmistakably the same style as the index cards. She wondered whether she had ever crossed paths with the person who compiled all this. The world was small enough to allow chance, and chance was sometimes stranger than fiction. Harold called her over to another bin, a small one this time, X 672. Inside lay a camera, an old one, heavy, film-based. The strap was worn, but the lens was intact. Jean lifted it, feeling the cold metal against her palm. When she opened the back, she froze. A half-used roll of film was still inside, not exposed, not developed, waiting. She gently closed it again. There were messages you didn't try to read before you were ready. She placed the camera aside, her mind filling with the silent possibilities of whatever images were frozen inside that strip. When the daylight began to thin, they reached bin X689. Inside, beneath a folded blanket, lay another phone. Not as old as a flip phone, but old enough to feel outdated. It had no battery, no SIM card, just a shell. Taped to it was a scrap of paper. If you keep going, you must finish. Jean steadied her breathing. The air in the unit felt heavier now, the fluorescent bulb humming faintly overhead, casting a cold light on the gathered fragments of someone's painstakingly curated life. Who had written these messages? Why place warnings instead of locks? Why preserve decades of mismatched, intimate, often personal objects and hide them behind a door in a forgotten aisle of a storage yard? The final bin they opened that day was X700, the last in the back row. Inside lay nothing except a single notebook. Its cover was plain, worn, the color of faded charcoal. Jean opened it gently. Every page was blank, except the last. On the final page, written in the same handwriting she had seen on the catalog cards, there was a single line: "Some collections choose their finders." She closed the notebook quietly, her hand trembling just enough for Harold to notice. He didn't ask questions. He simply stepped closer, placing one hand on the edge of the bin and the other on her shoulder, steadying the moment. They left the unit with slow, measured steps, locking the red door firmly behind them. Neither spoke on the way to the car. Their thoughts were too full, too tangled with possibilities and unease. The wind had picked up, brushing against the gravel in soft waves. As Jean buckled her seatbelt, she glanced back once more at the silent row of units, and she realized something with stark clarity. Whatever story had built itself inside those plastic bins was far from finished. And tomorrow, when they returned for their final day before the 48-hour deadline expired, the unit would not feel like a place holding objects anymore. It would feel like a place holding answers. Answers that someone, somewhere, had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury. The following morning arrived with a kind of deliberate calm that almost felt staged, as if the world had held its breath long enough and was now ready to release everything at once. Jean stepped out of the car slowly, feeling the cool air settle across her face in a way that reminded her of quiet mornings during her teaching years when she arrived before dawn to prepare her classroom. She felt the same mixture of anticipation and responsibility now, and she carried it with a steadiness that surprised her. The storage rows stretched out in crisp, orderly lines, their red doors catching the early light like squares in a giant calendar, each one silently marking time in ways that only objects know how to do. Harold walked beside her with the familiar pace of a man who accepted work not as a chore, but as a quiet calling. And though neither of them said a word, they both understood that today would not simply be about finishing the inventory. Today was about closing a chapter that had opened almost by accident and grown into something that demanded clarity, courage, and a level of trust they had not had to summon in years. Inside, the unit felt fuller than before, even though everything it had unpacked still sat in organized islands of categories: documents, jewelry, memorabilia, oddities, keys, photos, and items that defied any coherent label. The fluorescent bulb flickered once, as if acknowledging them, then steadied into its usual pale glow. Jean pulled out her notebook, smoothing the pages with the same care she used when grading essays long ago. The list she had compiled across 4 days had grown into a precise map of the unit's contents, an archive within an archive, and today her goal was to bring the chaos into full order before their 48-hour access expired. She reviewed the categories and cross-checked the bins they had yet to consolidate, noticing connections she hadn't seen before. Dates that aligned oddly, objects that seemed deliberately placed near one another, and patterns that hinted at a curation far more intentional than random accumulation. Every detail felt like a breadcrumb left by someone with a mind that thrived on systems and secrets, and understanding that design became Jean's quiet mission as she prepared for a long day of sorting. Harold began by rearranging the island of metal keys, separating duplicates and pairing them with items that might belong to them. The sheer number of keys still felt unsettling, yet he approached the task with the simple patience of someone who knew that every system, no matter how complex, could be understood through consistency and repetition. Jean, meanwhile, moved through a collection of envelopes and documents, arranging them chronologically, surprised to find that many of the mismatched items align into broad patterns when placed side by side. Some years seemed to repeat across unrelated folders. Some places appeared across multiple categories. Some photos showed buildings before they became the schools she had once worked in, revealing renovations and expansions she had never known were part of their history. These discoveries pulled her into a reflective calm. They connected her past to this strange inheritance in a way she hadn't expected, not through sentimentality, but through the steady grounding of familiarity. For the first time since they had opened the unit, she sensed that the chaos was beginning to make sense, not in a way that saw the mystery outright, but in a way that honored the truth that life stories often overlap without fully merging. As the morning passed, they began consolidating items into boxes they would take home for appraisal. The gold bracelets, the antique coins, and the small velvet-lined case of loose gemstones went into one secure container. The collection of old cameras, undeveloped film, and curiosity objects went into another. Jean felt a strange tenderness handling these items, not because she knew their value in dollars, but because they had clearly meant something to someone who spent decades preserving them in a manner bordering on ritual. She wondered if the person who stored these items ever intended for anyone to find them, or whether this unit was meant to outlive him. A quiet archive of a complicated life. The thought softened her heart rather than tightened it, and she found herself hoping that, wherever he was now, the person would understand that she and Harold were treating his history with the kind of dignity he must have wished for. Midday arrived with a breeze that carried the scent of warm asphalt into the unit. Jean opened the final bin, one they had left intentionally for last, labeled simply A-Z Index. Inside, she expected to find an alphabetical inventory, something that would make mapping the unit straightforward. Instead, she found a binder full of blank divider tabs, each pristine, untouched, and without even a pencil mark. It was as though the collector had planned to build an index, but never began, leaving the final chapter unwritten. At first, she felt disappointment, but it quickly gave way to something gentler, a realization that not every story needs complete ending to carry meaning. Sometimes, she thought, the final pages are left empty, because the next reader is meant to write them. She closed the binder with a sense of acceptance that felt surprisingly peaceful. In the late afternoon, as they began moving the items they intended to keep into their truck, Jean's phone buzzed. Not the old flip phone, the real one. For a moment she froze, half expecting another anonymous threat. Instead, the screen showed their daughter's number. The relief that washed over her widened something in her chest. She answered softly and found herself unexpectedly filled with warmth as their daughter's voice carried through the speaker, asking how the sorting was going and reminding them to take breaks. The conversation was simple, ordinary, and beautifully grounding, and it helped lighten the heaviness that had clung to Jean since the first warning message. When she hung up, she felt steadier, more anchored. That call gave shape to something she hadn't fully acknowledged. The journey through this mysterious unit had pulled her not into danger, but back into connection, into purpose, into a new sense of direction she didn't know she had been missing. The final hour in the unit passed with a quiet reverence. Harold swept the floor out of old habit, leaving the space cleaner than they had found it. Jean labeled their packed boxes with neat, careful handwriting, feeling a sense of authorship over something much larger than a storage auction. The red door, when rolled down for the last time, echoed through the corridor with a note that felt almost ceremonial. It didn't signify an ending so much as the closing of a chapter that had changed both of them in ways they would reflect on much later. As they walked back to their car, carrying the weight of the past in their arms and the possibilities of the future in their hearts, neither felt fear anymore. Instead, they felt a profound gratitude for curiosity, for courage, for each other, and for the chance to transform forgotten relic of someone else's history into the beginning of their own next step. When they returned home that evening, their living room transformed into a small museum of the unit's most meaningful treasures. Jean arranged the folders of documents neatly along the coffee table, not to unravel a mystery, but to honor the fragments of human experience contained within them. She poured tea for herself and Harold, and as they sat together under the soft lamplight, she felt a stirring of something long dormant, a desire to bring order, meaning, and creativity back into her life in a way she hadn't felt since retiring from teaching. She spoke quietly about the idea of turning this experience into an independent project, perhaps a community class on archiving personal history, or a workshop helping families preserve their memories with care, or even a storytelling group for retirees, exploring the narratives hidden in their own attics and basements. Harold listened with a warm, thoughtful smile, recognizing the spark he had missed in her since her early career. It wasn't just the objects that revived something in her. It was a reminder that purpose can be rediscovered in the most unexpected places. Over the following weeks, the mystery faded into reflection rather than tension. The threatening messages stopped, the silence settled, and the world resumed its ordinary rhythm. Appraisals revealed that some items were valuable enough to provide them with a comfortable cushion, though not enough to change their lifestyle dramatically, just enough to ease burdens and support new hobbies. Jean used part of the funds to rent a small room at the community center. She transformed it into a space for storytelling and memory preservation, inviting neighbors and retirees to bring old photos, letters, and keepsakes, teaching them how to archive their histories with care. She found herself surrounded by people again, guiding them, listening to them, helping them uncover meaning in their lives the same way she had uncovered meaning inside the unit. And through this work, she felt a gentle, beautiful renewal, proof that purpose never disappears. It simply waits for the right moment to return. Harold, too, rediscovered something in himself. He volunteered to help restore old equipment at a nearby heritage museum, donating several of the antique cameras and typewriters from a unit to their historical collection. The curators accepted them with gratitude, promising to display them with notes acknowledging the anonymous donor who preserved them. Harold felt pride not in the donation itself, but in the idea that he and Jean had given forgotten items a second life, a continuation, not an ending. In the soft arc of time that followed, the storage unit became a story they told gently, not with fear or drama, but with the quiet amazement that life can still surprise even after decades of routine. And the final moral settled into Jean's heart with maturity and grace. Sometimes life hands you an unfinished story, not to confuse you, but to remind you that the next chapters are yours to write. Sometimes purpose hides inside sealed boxes, forgotten crates, and old plastic bins, not because it is lost, but because it is waiting for someone brave enough, curious enough, and kind enough to find it. And so, with their lives enriched, their days full of new meaning, and their spirits steadier than they've been in years, Jean and Harold stepped into the next chapter side by side, grateful not for the value of what they found, but for the value of what the discovery returned to them. Connection, purpose, and a renewed belief that even in the quiet later years of life, hope still has a way of opening doors.